Winter dusk bled across the high plains, painting the sky in bruised purples and dying gold. The wind came low and mean, pushing against Eli Thatcher's horse as if to drive both man and beast back the way they came. The land was open, lonely, too quiet for comfort, too wide for forgetting. He rode with his collar up, hat pulled low, the sound of his horse's hooves swallowed by snow that hadn't yet decided whether to fall or stay frozen in the clouds. He'd been drifting north for weeks, sleeping beneath cottonwoods, living on coffee and jerky and the kind of silence a man earns only after he's lost enough to stop talking about it. There was no destination, not really, only distance from the grave he'd left behind in Texas. Her name had been Martha, and he hadn't spoken it aloud in over a year. By the time he reached the rise overlooking the river bend, daylight was gone. A ruined wagon sat tilted on its side below, one wheel half buried in the frozen mud. The smell reached him before the sight did. Iron and death. Wolves. Eli drew his rifle and descended slowly, eyes scanning the drifts. The wolves were still there, dark shapes hunched around what was left of the horses. Their eyes flashed yellow in the half-light. One raised its muzzle, low growl, rumbling through the wind. "Git," Eli said under his breath, stepping closer. When they didn't, he fired once into the air. The echo cracked through the valley like thunder. The pack scattered into the scrub, shadows peeling away from the dead. Only then did he hear the sound. A faint moan. Human. He moved around the wagon and found her half buried under a torn blanket, face pale, blood dark on her shoulder. A young woman, Apache by her dress and the beadwork still clinging to her torn shawl. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed but burning with something fierce even in pain. She tried to speak, then flinched, reaching for a knife that wasn't there. "Easy," Eli said, kneeling beside her. "Ain't here to hurt you," she tried to push him away weakly. Her voice came out cracked, dry as dust. "Go." "Can't do that." He glanced at the darkening sky. "You'll freeze before the wolves finish what they started." When she tried again to sit up, she collapsed against him, half-conscious. He gathered her up, surprised at how light she was. For a moment he hesitated, knowing the line he crossed by touching her, by getting involved at all, but the choice had already been made. The nearest cabin he knew of lay a mile east, an old trapper's place abandoned years back. He carried her there through the storm's first whispers, each gust biting sharper than the last. The door hung half off its hinges, but the stone hearth inside was solid. He laid her down on a bedroll, started a fire, and worked in silence, boots thudding softly on rough boards, the smell of pine smoke filling the cold air. When she woke again, flames painted her face in gold and shadow. She looked around, confusion narrowing her gaze to suspicion. "Where am I?" "Safe," Eli said, stirring the fire. "For now." She pulled the blanket higher, wary. "You took me. Dragged you out of a wolf's mouth," he said simply. Didn't figure that needed permission. Her lips tightened. "You should have left me," Eli didn't answer. He just reached for the pot, poured her a tin cup of water and held it out. After a long silence, she took it, watching him as though the gesture were some kind of trick. "Name's Eli," he said after a while. "You got one?" She hesitated. "Clara?" He nodded once, setting the pot back. "You're hurt, Clara. Might be a few days before you can walk proper." "I will walk tomorrow." "Maybe," he said, half smiling without humor. "If you've got a death wish." She turned her face toward the fire, saying nothing. The wind outside hissed through the cracks in the wall, carrying the sound of coyotes somewhere far off. The world beyond the cabin seemed endless, nothing but snow and ghosts. Eli sat on the floor near the door, rolling a cigarette he didn't light. His hands trembled faintly from the cold, or maybe from something else. He hadn't spoken this many words to another soul in months. In the quiet that followed, he found himself studying her. The scar that crossed her collarbone. The way her braid was coming undone, strands of black hair catching the firelight. She noticed, eyes flashing toward him. "You stare like a thief," she said. He looked away. "Just making sure you ain't bleeding through the bandage." A small sound left her throat, something like a scoff. "You think I'm your burden now?" "I don't think much of anything anymore." He rose, adjusted the rifle by the door. Sleep. I'll take watch. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavy. The wind whistled against the shutters, and the roof creaked like an old man's bones. Eli leaned against the frame, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the white distance. Through the narrow window he saw nothing but darkness. Inside, Clara lay awake, listening to his boots shifting on the floorboards, to the crackle of the fire. She studied the silhouette of him, broad shoulders, still as a carving, and wondered what sort of man saved a stranger just to sit in silence afterward. When her eyelids grew heavy, she whispered something in her own tongue, a small prayer, half warning, half gratitude. He didn't understand the words, but the sound of them, soft and low, stirred something quiet in him. By the time dawn edged gray along the horizon, the fire had burned low. Eli poured the last of the coffee grounds into the pot, the smell sharp in the chill air. Clara stirred, sitting up, her eyes softer than before. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Didn't need to," he replied. "You lie," she murmured. "I can see it in your face," he almost smiled. "Maybe." She looked toward the window, where snow still fell in thin, tired flakes. "You saved me," she said finally, the words almost reluctant. "Why?" Eli stared into the embers, voice low. "Didn't seem right, leaving anyone to the wolves." She studied him for a long while, then said, "Maybe you should have." He met her gaze, steady, unreadable. "Maybe I should have," he agreed. Outside, the wind carried off the last howl of the night. Inside, silence settled again. Not the cold kind this time, but the kind that feels like a fragile truce between two souls who've already lost too much. Morning came slow to the valley, pale light creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls, like it feared disturbing the silence inside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white and stillness. Eli Thatcher stirred the coals in the hearth, coaxing them back to life. His breath hung in the cold air like smoke. Behind him, Clara lay still beneath a patchwork blanket, her dark hair spilling over the edge of the cot. For a moment he thought she slept. But then she spoke, voice quiet as the thawing wind. "You rise before the sun," she said. "Old habit," he replied, feeding the fire a few splinters of pine. "Cowboy's habit." "Widowers," he muttered. The word hung there, uninvited. Clara said nothing. She only turned her face toward the wall, away from him. The days that followed moved slow, measured by the rhythm of melting snow and the hiss of the kettle over the flame. Clara's wounds scabbed, her strength returned by degrees. She spoke little, yet watched everything. The way he poured coffee, the careful way he moved around her, never too close. He never asked questions, never demanded her story, and that confused her most of all. Men she had known before, settlers, soldiers, wanted something in return for their mercy. This one did not. He built her a better bed from the old wagon boards outside. He patched the roof where the wind moaned through. When she burned with fever one night, he laid cool rags on her forehead, whispering nonsense prayers to a God he hadn't spoken to since Martha died. By dawn, her fever broke. When she woke, she saw him asleep in the chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, hat tilted low. For the first time, she studied him without suspicion. The lines in his face spoke of years spent in sun and regret. The scar across his jaw looked old, like a wound earned for someone else's sake. She didn't wake him. That afternoon, she insisted on walking outside. He argued. She went anyway. The snow had begun to sink into the soil, turning to mud beneath their boots. The mountains glowed pale blue in the distance, smoke from the fire curling into the clear sky. Clara moved slowly, each step careful. Eli followed, hands in his coat pockets, keeping a quiet distance. "They'll come looking," she said after a while. "Who?" "My people," she answered. Then after a pause, "Or yours," he nodded. "Maybe, but not yet. They don't come this far in winter. You think you're safe here?" He smiled faintly. "Ain't been safe a day in my life." She stopped walking and looked at him then. Really looked. "Then why save me?" He met her eyes, steady, almost weary. "Didn't seem right leaving you to the wolves." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe I was already theirs." Eli said nothing. There was nothing a man could say to that. That night the wind returned, carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Inside the cabin, Clara sat cross-legged near the fire, combing her hair with her fingers, untangling the mess left by snow and pain. She found a thin leather cord among her things and began to braid. The motion was slow, deliberate, each twist and pull an act of quiet defiance against the chaos that had broken her life apart. Eli sat at the table, oiling his Colt revolver. The old gun gleamed in the firelight, its steel catching every flicker. It was a ritual he hadn't done in months, not since the night he'd buried Martha and sworn off killing for good. But tonight his hands needed purpose. When the braid was done, Clara tied it with the cord and let it fall over her shoulder. She caught him staring, not at her, but at the braid itself, as if it reminded him of something long gone. "You stare again," she said softly, not unkindly this time. He blinked, looked down at the revolver. "Sorry." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "Your wife, she braided her hair like this?" Eli hesitated, then nodded once. "Every morning." Said it kept her thoughts straight. A small, sad smile touched Clara's lips. "Your woman was wise." "She was," he said quietly. "And I wasn't." The fire popped. Outside, the night deepened. No sound but the groan of trees shifting under thaw. Clara looked into the flames. "I had a brother once. Younger than me. He liked to watch the storms. Said the sky talked when it thundered." Eli said nothing. "He died when soldiers came," she continued. "They said we had stolen horses. They killed him first. I ran. I have been running since." The words came flat, stripped of tears long since shed. Eli's jaw tightened. "My wife died of fever. I was out riding fence when it took her. She asked me to stay that morning. I didn't." Clara turned her head. "So we both left someone behind." "Looks that way." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was heavy, full, like rain clouds before a storm. They sat that way until the fire burned low, two people bound not by language or law, but by the same empty ache. At last, Clara spoke again. "You think kindness makes you weak?" He met her eyes. "It does sometimes." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It makes you dangerous, because it means you still remember what matters." Her voice was quiet, but it struck him harder than a bullet. He looked down at the revolver, the old symbol of justice he no longer believed in. Then he set it aside. When he glanced up again, she was watching him, eyes softer now. "You're not the only one who lost someone," she said. He nodded slowly. "No, guess I ain't." The logs shifted in the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. The warmth filled the room, and for the first time since either could remember, it didn't feel borrowed later. As she drifted to sleep, Eli sat awake by the hearth, the memory of her words turning over in his mind. The snow outside had nearly melted. Spring was coming, whether they were ready or not. And in that soft, flickering light, something inside him began, very faintly, to thaw. The wind began to change that morning, slow at first, like breath drawn before a sigh. By noon, it had turned to a growl rolling down from the mountains, carrying the smell of snow and iron. Eli Thatcher stood outside the cabin, hat pulled low, watching the sky thicken with gray. The air felt heavy, charged, like the land itself was waiting for something mean to happen. Inside, Clara was grinding dried herbs between two stones. Her hands moved steady, practiced. "Storm comes," she said without looking up. "Yeah," Eli answered. "Looks bad." He tightened the straps on his coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder. "We're near out of meat. I'll go get us something before it hits full." Clara frowned. "You go far, you die." He smiled faintly. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. When he turned toward the hills, she called after him, not to stop him, but to hand him her small knife, its handle wrapped in deer hide. "For luck," she said. He nodded, tucking it into his belt. "I'll bring it back." The snow came early. By the time he reached the tree line, it was falling thick, clinging to his coat, whispering over the tracks of a lone deer. Eli followed them into the pines, the forest dim and silent, but for the creak of branches. He moved slow, careful, but not careful enough. A sound split the stillness. Not hooves, voices. Two men laughing low. He ducked behind a fallen log, peering through the drift. They were rough-looking, outlaws by their coats, and the rifles slung careless over their backs. Reckon that's him, one said. Scout from Fort Duncan. Heard he carries bounty money in his saddlebag. Eli's jaw tightened. He'd met their kind before, men who saw ghosts where there were only wanderers. He could have called out, told them they were wrong. But words rarely mattered once a man's greed was louder than sense. The first shot cracked through the snow. Bark exploded near his head. Eli dropped to his belly, returned fire. One outlaw stumbled, fell, red spreading across the white. The other rushed forward, knife flashing in the blur of snow. They met hard, the fight short and ugly. Grunts, curses, the smell of gunpowder and blood mixing with the storm. When it ended, Eli was on his knees, clutching his side, the world tilting. The outlaw lay still beside him, eyes already glassed over. He looked down at his hand, blood dark against his coat. The wind rose into a howl. Snow swallowed everything. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. The cold crept fast, numbing his fingers, his breath fogging thick. He thought of the cabin, the fire, the woman inside who'd started to braid her hair again. He thought of Martha, too, how she used to hum while boiling coffee, how she'd told him once that some people weren't meant to die warm. Then, the storm took him. Back at the cabin, the world was all white noise. Clara pressed her palm against the window, heart drumming. The wind screamed, the kind that tears roofs loose and buries horses alive. She waited for hours, though she knew waiting killed slower than cold. When darkness fell, she gathered what she needed, shawl, herbs, a torch of pine pitch. She stepped into the storm, eyes narrowed against the sting. The world outside had no edges, only endless white and roaring wind. She followed her instincts, not sight, but scent, shape, memory. The snow spoke if you knew how to listen. There, faint tracks half covered already, one drag mark deeper than the rest. She followed, her braid whipping behind her like a black flame. After what felt like hours, she found him. Half buried against a log, head bowed, blood frozen along his side. His horse stood nearby, reins tangled in brush, steam rising weakly from its nostrils. Eli, she said, kneeling beside him. His eyes flickered, unfocused. Clara? His voice was barely sound. Quiet. She pressed her fingers to his wound, then tore the edge of her shawl to wrap it tight. You walk or you die here. He tried to stand. His legs gave way. She got under his arm, dragging him step by brutal step through the storm. The wind fought her, biting every inch of skin it could find. But she kept going, through pain, through fear, through memories of the brother she couldn't save. This time, she would not lose someone to the snow. When at last the cabin came into sight, she almost fell from relief. She pulled him through the door and shut out the storm with a kick, collapsing beside him on the floor. The fire had gone out. She worked fast, stacking wood, striking flint, building heat back into the world. Then she cleaned his wound with melted snow and herbs, her fingers steady though her heart was not. He drifted in and out of sense. Once in the fever's haze he whispered a name. Martha. Voice cracked and pleading. Clara froze. She knew what that meant. Every man carried a ghost, still she didn't leave. She ground more herbs, pressed them into the wound, wiped his brow. Then softly, she began to hum, an old Apache song, half prayer, half lullaby. It filled the cabin like smoke, warm and strange, wrapping around the sound of his ragged breathing. Hours passed before the fever broke. Eli stirred, blinking toward the firelight. His eyes found her face, tired, smudged with soot, framed by the glow. Storm's gone, she said. He swallowed hard. So I ain't dead then. Not yet. She smiled faintly. You saved me from wolves. Now I saved you from the storm. He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken flickering between them. Gratitude, sorrow, maybe both. Then he whispered, Guess that makes us even. Clara shook her head. No one is ever even. Outside the wind began to fade. Inside, the fire burned bright, reflecting in their eyes. Two survivors bound by a thread of mercy neither could name. Eli closed his eyes again, and this time, sleep came without ghosts. The storm broke 2 days later. When morning came, the land was washed pale, all silver light and dripping eaves. The snow no longer fell. It melted, soft and slow, into the thirsty earth. From the cabin porch, Eli watched rivulets run down the hill, carrying the last of winter away. Inside, Clara moved with quiet precision, folding blankets, tending the fire, grinding more herbs though his wound no longer bled. Her movements were deliberate, distant, the care of a woman preparing herself to leave. "You're mending quick," she said without looking at him. "Got good medicine?" Eli replied. She gave a small hum that wasn't quite agreement. "Soon I go." He turned to face her. "Go where?" "Back to my people." He leaned against the post, arms crossed. "They might not be where you left them." "Winter scatters folks." "You said that yourself. I find them," she said, voice sharp as flint. "Not your worry." He nodded slowly, though the words cut sharper than he let show. "Didn't say it was." They fell silent. The sound of dripping from the roof filled the space between them, steady as a heartbeat. In the days that followed, a fragile rhythm took hold. Clara stitched new lining into his coat, grumbling about his rough hands. Eli chopped wood and repaired the corral fence behind the cabin. They rarely spoke, yet somehow each gesture answered the other. Two lives learning to fit, if only for a little while. At night, they sat by the fire. Sometimes she braided rope from horsehair. Sometimes he carved small shapes from driftwood. Nothing useful, just something to keep his hands busy. The quiet between them was no longer heavy. It had turned almost gentle. Still, both knew it couldn't last. The world outside waited, and the world was cruel to things that didn't fit. One afternoon, as Clara hung her shawl to dry, Eli saw dust rising on the ridge beyond the creek, 2 riders coming slow. He felt his gut tighten. Few men rode out here without reason. He stepped inside, checked the Colt on the table, and stood at the doorway until the figures came into focus. They were ranch hands from south of the valley, men he'd worked with a few seasons back. Their faces were roughened by sun and whiskey, the kind that smiled only when mocking. "Well, I'll be damned," the taller one called as they neared. "Didn't figure you for hiding out up here, Thatcher. Thought maybe you'd drank yourself into the ground by now." Eli kept his tone even. "Reckon I was halfway there," the man laughed. His eyes flicked past Eli toward the cabin. "Ain't just whiskey keeping you warm, huh? Heard tell there's an Apache woman been seen around. Guess she's yours now." Eli's jaw tightened. "Careful," the man smirked. "What, you gonna shoot me for speaking plain?" "Don't see how you stomach it. Sharp." He didn't finish. Eli's revolver was in his hand before the second breath. The hammer clicked back, the barrel steady on the man's chest. "You best turn around," Eli said, voice low but iron solid. Now the air went still. Even the horses seemed to hold breath. The men stared, something cold dawning in their eyes, the realization that he wasn't bluffing. The taller one spat into the snow, muttered something under his breath, then jerked his reins. The other followed. As they rode off, Eli lowered the gun but didn't holster it. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, from the weight of old anger stirred awake. When he turned back, Clara was standing in the doorway. Her face was unreadable, dark eyes steady on his. "Why?" she asked. He slid the revolver onto the table. "Because they were wrong to talk that way." "Wrong to who?" she said sharply. "To me or to you?" He took a breath, exhaled slow. "To both, I reckon." Her gaze hardened. "You defend me as if I belong to you." "You don't," he said. His voice came rough, cracked around the edges. "But I won't let men talk about you like they did my wife." For a long moment, neither moved. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, hesitant, pattering against the window pane. The sound filled the silence like a whisper neither could answer. Clara's expression softened, though pride held her chin high. "You still love her," she said quietly. "I do," Eli admitted. "Always will. Then why look at me as though you're lost?" He met her eyes. "Because maybe I am." The rain deepened, running off the roof in silver threads. Clara turned away, moving to the fire. She crouched there, poking at the embers. "You think kindness is the same as saving," she said. "But it is not. Some things do not want saving. Eli walked closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "You'd have died if I left you out there." "Yes," she said simply. "And maybe that would have been cleaner." Her words hit him like a blow. He started to speak, then stopped. Instead, he sank into the chair across from her, staring into the fire. The flames licked the space between them, orange and gold and too bright for the quiet things they couldn't say. After a long while, Clara stood. She pulled her shawl from its hook, draped it around her shoulders. The firelight caught the beadwork, reds and blacks glimmering like old blood. "When the snow melts, I go," she said again. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the coals. "I know." She hesitated at the doorway, her silhouette framed against the rain. "You are not like other men," she said softly. "But you carry their anger." "One day it will eat you," he didn't answer. She stepped outside, the rain darkening her shawl almost instantly. He listened to her footsteps fade into the soft rhythm of falling water. When she returned some time later, soaked and silent, she found him still there, hat in his hands, fire dying low. She said nothing, and neither did he. The night passed in uneasy quiet, the roof dripping steady as the thoughts neither dared voice. Outside, winter's last snow turned to mud. Inside, something just as heavy, pride, longing, sorrow, began to melt. The snow vanished with the last of March. The hills turned soft and green, though the wind still carried a bite. Rivers swelled with meltwater, whispering through the ravines like restless ghosts. For the first time in months, Eli felt the ache of spring, that old restlessness that came when a man had stayed too long in one place. Clara felt it too. She moved lighter now, her limp gone, her steps sure. She spent mornings near the stream, washing what clothes had survived the winter, hair unbound in the breeze. Sometimes Eli caught himself watching her, not as a stranger anymore, but as something constant, a shape that had filled the emptiness without asking permission. He told himself she'd leave soon. He told himself he was ready. But neither of those things was true. One evening, near sundown, he caught sight of something wrong. Boot tracks, where there shouldn't have been any. 2 sets, maybe 3, circling from the ridge and down toward the creek. He followed them a ways, crouched low behind the brush. Then he saw them. 2 men, ragged and armed, one with a bandaged arm. The same outlaws from the storm, the ones who'd left him bleeding in the snow. They hadn't forgotten. He hurried back to the cabin. "Pack what you can," he told Clara. "We've got company coming." Her eyes flashed, steady and calm. "How many?" 2, maybe more. They think I've got gold. I don't. Then they will come to take your life instead. He nodded grimly. That's about right. Without another word, she moved, swift, purposeful. From behind the stove, she pulled a small bow, strung with sinew, and a quiver of arrows bound in leather. He'd never seen them before, and something in the sight made him feel both proud and afraid. They barred the door, doused the lanterns, and waited. Outside, the last light of dusk turned the valley to bronze. Then, hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin like wolves testing their prey. A voice called out, mocking and familiar. "Thatcher, you still breathing in there? We've come to finish our talk." Eli stayed silent, gun steady in his hand. "Come on now," the outlaw sneered. "Ain't no sense hiding. Bring out the girl. We'll let you die easy." The words turned Clara's face to stone. She knocked an arrow, drawing back the bowstring until it whispered tight. Eli met her eyes. "When they move, you shoot." The door shuddered. One hard kick, then another. On the third, it splintered inward. A man stumbled through, rifle raised. The crack of Eli's Colt filled the cabin. The outlaw dropped, twisting in the half-light. From the window, another shape lunged into view. Clara's arrow flew, clean and silent, striking deep into his shoulder. He screamed and fired blindly. The shot caught the wall, splintering wood, sparks flying into the hearth. The fire caught fast. The dry pine flared, smoke curling up the beams. "Get down!" Eli shouted, dragging Clara away from the spreading blaze. He fired twice more through the doorway. Outside, hoofbeats scrambled, one man cursing, another falling silent. Then came the smell of smoke thickening, dry, choking, relentless. The flames climbed higher, licking the rafters. "We have to go," Clara coughed. Eli glanced toward the door. Firelight flickered across the floorboards. "You first," he said. They burst outside into the dark. The sky had turned red from the reflection of the burning cabin. One outlaw staggered near the corral, clutching his arm. Eli raised his revolver. "Don't!" Clara said sharply. He froze, finger on the trigger. The man looked at them once, fear plain in his eyes, then mounted his horse and vanished into the trees. Eli lowered the gun. "He'll bring more trouble." "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. Sometimes fear runs faster than hate." They stood together, watching the flames consume the only home they'd had through winter. Sparks drifted into the black sky, carried off by the wind. Clara's shawl had caught an ember, a small burn, a hole glowing red, but she didn't seem to notice. Eli's arm bled again, torn from the fight. She saw it, stepped close, and pressed her hand over the wound. The gesture was simple, steady, the kind that held both care and claim. "You saved me again," she said softly. He gave a bitter half-smile. "Looks like we just keep taking turns." When the roof gave way, the sound was like thunder. The flames roared higher, reflecting in Clara's eyes. Her hand stayed on his chest, feeling the hammer of his heartbeat beneath the grime and blood. "You're mine now," she whispered. Eli stiffened, not from fear but from the weight of her words. She looked up at him, fierce, unflinching. "Not to own," she said, voice trembling now. "To remind you, you're still alive." Something inside him gave way, not to desire, but to release. He reached up, covered her hand with his. The skin beneath his palm was warm, alive, real. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man made of ashes. The fire burned until dawn, until nothing was left but blackened beams and the smell of smoke drifting through wet grass. They sat side by side on the ridge above it, wrapped in the same blanket, saying nothing. When the sun finally rose, gold and forgiving, Clara's head rested on his shoulder. Eli's thoughts were quiet for once. "What now?" she murmured. He stared out over the valley where mist rolled low over the hills. "Now we build something new. Even if it don't last," Clara smiled faintly. "Everything ends. But some things deserve to begin." He looked at her then. Not the stranger from the snow, not the woman from the fire, but the only truth he'd found since losing everything. As the morning light washed over them, smoke rose behind like a shadow of the life they'd burned away. Ahead lay only open country, wild and waiting. For the first time, the thought of starting again didn't scare him. The land healed before they did. Weeks passed and the valley turned green again. Grass pushed through blackened ash, tender and defiant. The creek ran high with snowmelt, whispering through cattails and stones. Birds returned, meadowlarks, red-winged blackbirds, their songs scattering the silence that had once ruled the hills. Eli moved slower now. His arm was bound with a rough bandage, his breath shallow from the smoke that had filled his lungs that night. Still he worked. Each dawn he rose, set his hat against the rising sun, and began to rebuild. The cabin stood only in bones now, half walls, scorched timbers, the ghost of a roof, but he hammered and sawed and patched it piece by piece. Clara stayed. For a time, she worked beside him without being asked, carrying buckets from the creek, mending his torn shirts, brushing soot from what furniture remained. She never called it home, but she moved through it with the quiet surety of someone who understood what survival demanded. When the first spring rain came, they sheltered beneath a patched canvas. The smell of wet earth filled the air, rich and new. Clara laughed once, softly, as though surprised she still could, when the drops hit her face. Eli watched her, the lines of his weathered face softening. "Don't waste it," she said, lifting her chin to the downpour. "Rain this clean doesn't come often," he smiled faintly. "Ain't much I could waste now." The rain fell harder. For a long while, they sat side by side in silence, each lost in the rhythm of the storm, the thunder rolling like the pulse of the earth itself. When it passed, the world smelled of renewal, but something unspoken lingered, the knowing that soon she would go. He felt it before she spoke it. It was near sundown when she came to him, standing at the edge of the half-built porch, her shawl drawn close, her horse already saddled. The sky behind her glowed orange, the same color as the fire that had nearly taken them both. "I have to go," she said quietly. Eli didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the horizon where the mountains wore their crowns of snow. "Figured you would. I need to find my people. What's left of them?" He nodded, slow and steady. "Reckon that's right." She waited, maybe for a word to hold her there, but none came. The air between them was too full of things neither could say. Gratitude, sorrow, something like love, but older, quieter. "You will stay here?" she asked. "For a while," he said. "Land's still good. I'll see what can be made of it." She looked toward the rebuilt walls, the smoke curling from a small cooking fire. "You'll make it right again," she said. "You always do." He almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in his throat. "Maybe," he said instead. "Maybe not." For a long moment they simply stood there, the light fading between them. Then Clara stepped closer, just enough that he could see the reflection of the sky in her dark eyes. She reached out, hesitated, then touched his chest, right where her hand had rested that night when the cabin burned. Her voice came low. "You saved me from the wolves," he swallowed. "You saved me from the rest of them," she smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll save you from yourself someday." He looked at her then, really looked. At the woman who had walked out of fire and snow, who had taught him that silence could hold mercy as well as pain. He wanted to tell her she already had, but the words stayed buried, where most of his feelings lived. Instead, he simply nodded. "Ride careful." She turned away, swung easily into the saddle. The horse shifted beneath her, hooves crunching on damp earth. At the hill's crest, she paused and looked back. Her shawl lifted in the wind like a banner, crimson and black against the pale spring sky. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she raised one hand in farewell and rode on, a dark figure against the growing light, until the horizon swallowed her whole. Eli watched until she was gone. He stayed that way for a while, the chill evening settling around him. Then he turned back toward what remained, the porch, the tools, the quiet hum of life continuing. Inside, the rebuilt cabin smelled of smoke and fresh-cut pine. The fire in the hearth burned low, more glow than flame. On the mantel, something caught his eye. A thin braid of dark hair tied with a strip of red cloth. He reached for it slowly, as though afraid it might vanish if he touched it. The braid was soft, fine, still holding the faint scent of sage and smoke. She must have left it that morning without a word. He held it in his calloused hand, thumb tracing the woven strands. For a long while he said nothing. Then a small sound escaped him, half sigh, half laugh, the sound of a man remembering how to breathe. "Guess I'll hold you to that," he whispered. The fire crackled in answer. Outside, the night deepened. The rain returned, light and steady, pattering against the roof he'd rebuilt. Eli leaned back in his chair, coffee cooling beside him, eyes fixed on the window where the world turned silver under the moon. He thought of her riding north, of rivers and canyons, of the wild road that would test her again. And somewhere, he hoped, she'd think of him too. Not as a savior, not as a ghost, but as a man still trying to find his way home. When dawn came, he saddled his own horse and rode out to check the fences. The earth was soft underfoot, the sky clear and wide. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was riding away from something. The wind carried the scent of rain, sage, and far-off wood smoke, the smell of a world still willing to forgive. And as the trail curved east toward the river, he felt the faintest warmth spread through his chest, a pulse of life that hadn't been there in years. He smiled to himself, quiet and sure, whatever lay ahead, he would meet it, alive.